Despite the dramatic changes of the French Revolution and the reinvention of Europe under Napoleon, the issues of political authority and sovereignty remained at the heart of the post-revolutionary governments in France and elsewhere. The military defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1814 had been preceded by the creation of the Quadruple Alliance of Britain, Austria, and Prussia, all determined to return Europe to its pre-1789 foundations. The period between 1815 and the 1830s is often called the Restoration. In this lecture we'll examine the ways in which the Quadruple Alliance sought to re-establish legitimate governments and the various challenges that undermined its efforts. Let's begin with the Quadruple Alliance itself. Essentially a military alliance, the four powers attempted to retain their cohesion in the post-war moment. The alliance remained united in its quest to prevent French domination of the continent. This was the British goal in particular, due to its domination of markets and commerce following French downfall. But the Quadruple Alliance also sought to restore monarchical rule to those areas that had been liberated by Napoleon, including the French nation itself. The alliance was able to dominate post-war diplomacy, drawing boundaries and establishing treaties in the interests of the four large states. France, after the return of the Bourbon monarchy, would join the alliance in 1818. Often Napoleon is seen as the progenitor to the European Union, but the Quadruple Alliance and its successor, the Congress of Vienna, also show signs of modern interstate diplomacy. The Congress of Vienna was the diplomatic arm of the Quadruple Alliance. Due to its location and to the British tendency of non-intervention in European affairs, it was dominated by the Austrian foreign minister Metternich. Metternich was a staunch opponent of liberalism and nationalism and favored a return to monarchical rule and the estate system as guarantees for stable societies. Metternich also feared the rise of a single state in dominating European affairs, be it France, Britain, or Russia. The Congress set about redrawing the map of Europe, now that Napoleon had erased the traditional one. In doing so, the Congress rewarded states that had fought against Napoleon and had strong royal governments. Still, Congress was unable or unwilling to return to pre-1789 borders. Particularly in Central Europe, where the Holy Roman Empire had disappeared, Congress attempted a new solution, the German Confederation. The German Confederation was built upon structures Napoleon established in the German lands, although the power interests were now firmly in the hands of Austria and Prussia. In fact, these two kingdoms were able to dominate German politics outside of their borders through the mechanism of the Frankfurt Diet, which was a governing council of representatives of the German states. Since any changes required at least the vote of one of the great powers, Prussia and Austria established themselves as rivals in German affairs and prevented any other state from establishing itself or rising up. The Congress system of Europe re-established the legitimacy of dynastic rule over the new concept of nationalism. Metternich in particular feared the effects of nationalism in a kingdom such as Austria, in which Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Germans, and Slavs, among other ethnic types, were ruled over. The Congress system was also based on the balance of power. At first, the great powers feared the revival of France as a spoiler to European balance. However, as French conservatism became apparent, the powers began to fear Russia, which showed a greater interest in the Balkans and Central Europe. At the heart of the Congress system and the Quadruple Alliance was the preservation of the status quo as evidence of political legitimacy. The Bourbon crown practiced a policy known as oubli, which was the intentional forgetting of the Revolutionary era. All references to this time were removed from the public, including memorials, street names, and the Revolutionary calendar. The Church, on the other hand, sought to purify the body politic through penitence, the remembrance of sins committed during the Revolutionary era. This division created confusion in the public, and its liberal elements exploited this to critique the Restoration. the revolution could not entirely be subsumed into the status quo. Still, religion played an important role again in European society. Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed a separate alliance based on their support of religious institutions, known as the Holy Alliance. Religious revivals in Britain, the German states, and France signaled a renewed interest in spiritual life throughout the continent. In Restoration Europe, the status quo was based on the alliance of the Crown and Church. A cornerstone of absolutist doctrine, the reunification of these political forces sought to undo or undermine the changes in politics and society brought by the French Revolution. In places like France, noble privileges were restored. In the Papal States, all evidence of French occupation was removed, including secular schooling, street lighting, and vaccinations. The alliance between these two conservative elements has often been seen as the obvious response to the Revolution, but this does not explain why the Restoration in some places did not work. For example, in France, the alliance of the Bourbon monarchy and the Catholic Church would appear to be the way to return to absolutism. However, there was a schism between how the Crown and Church sought to deal with the issue of the Revolution. Contributing to this was the re-establishment of the nobility. The Congress system based its vision of order and natural law on the estate system. Across Europe, conservative thinkers such as Burke, de Maistre, and von Clausewitz legitimated the division of orders in society as the best way to avoid the violence of revolution. When the laws of God or nature were challenged, it only led to bloodshed was a common view. As part of their reinstatement, nobles filled representative assemblies in Prussia and France, and continued to do so in Britain, dominated appointments in the military and government service. An obvious example of this are the Junkers in Prussia, who gave up their serfs but gained a near monopoly on the officer appointments in the army. Despite the return of the old regime, Restoration Europe continued to face challenges presented by the French Revolution, namely liberalism and nationalism. Liberalism in Europe had two meanings. Economic liberalism was practiced in Britain, something we've seen already in our discussion of the Industrial Revolution, while political liberalism was the hope of those who had served the new order before the return of the nobility. Liberals in this sense sought for the expansion of the franchise, the formation of political parties, state-sponsored secular education for the lower classes, and government non-intervention in economics, a combination of all sorts of ideologies. Most of all, liberals sought constitutional guarantees of rights of speech, press, and assembly, things which the conservative order saw as inherently revolutionary. The ideas of liberalism, when put into action, presented a challenge to the Congress system. To give you some examples, in Spain, the restoration of the monarchy after the French occupation was undermined by the liberals' attempt to impose a constitution on Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand VII responded by calling the Catholic Church to recommence the Inquisition in Spain in 1814. Liberals were labeled as heretics, distancing them from the common people who were under the influence of local priests. Yet as this was happening, the Spanish crown's feeble hold on its colonies slipped, and one by one, each colony declared independence. This evaporation of resources provided liberals an opportunity, and they led a revolt against the Spanish king in 1820. The Congress powers decided to enforce the status quo through military means and invaded Spain. With the support of France and Russia, Ferdinand VII easily defeated the liberals, executing them in public displays of power, and restored absolutism in Spain. Even in Russia, liberalism cast a shadow. Secret societies of nobles, many of whom were schooled in Western institutions, banded together during the 1820s despite the fear of repression. With Alexander's death in 1825, a succession crisis occurred. The reformist nobles supported Constantine, who then stepped aside in favor of his reactionary brother Nicholas. Challenging Nicholas's ascension to Tsar, the Decembrists gained the support of the military in St. Petersburg and attempted to force Nicholas to abdicate. He used the Russian army from outside the capital to crush the Decembrist revolt, and despite their failure, the issue of reform became a part of Russian politics during the 19th century. Yet the Congress system had definite limits. In the case of Greek independence, the system was shown as faulty. The idea of status quo had accepted the authority of the Ottoman Empire, despite the religious differences between the Christian monarchies and the Muslim Sultanate. Still, both Russia and Austria sought to increase their influence in the Balkans. Russia wanted to gain control of the Bosphorus Straits, which would open the Black Sea to Russian commerce. Tsar Alexander clandestinely supported a group of Greek insurgents who attempted to overthrow Ottoman rule on the Hellenic Peninsula. When this failed, the Congress system chastised the Greeks, as a sign of support would undermine the foundation of the status quo. Yet more Europeans became interested in the plight of the Greeks, particularly romantic writers and artists. English poets, such as Byron and Shelley, both participated in the Greek revolts, with Byron dying in Greece in 1820. French Romantic painter Eugene Delacroix painted scenes of horror of the Ottoman reprisals on the Greek population. In the end, under pressure from the British and their own interests, the Congress system condemned the Ottoman atrocities and forced the Turks to recognize Greek independence in 1832. This decision ultimately ended the Congress system as a method of diplomacy and legitimation in the post-revolutionary world. Nationalism played a spoiler role elsewhere. Nationalist revolts occurred during the 1830s in both Poland and Belgium. The revolt in Poland was suppressed by the Russians, who were still smarting from the Decembrist revolt, while both the British and French supported the Belgians. Nationalism was also prevalent in Ireland, although nationalism in that case was also conflated with Catholicism. The continued existence of the Test Acts ensured Catholic exclusion from the government, which in this case meant the majority of the Irish population. The threat of revolt in Ireland was diminished somewhat with the repeal of the Test Acts in the early 1830s as part of the Reform era in Britain. Nevertheless, nationalism still provided a threat to the status quo. The great experiment in Restoration Europe was the return of the Bourbons to the French throne. The new king, Louis XVIII, accepted the Code Napoleon and the Charter, a provisional guarantee of rights. In the newly created Chamber of Deputies, a faction of extreme right-wing nobles, the Ultras, dominated. This group pushed for strict government control of the press and for the return of confiscated lands lost during the French Revolution. Louis was moderate on these issues, but his successor was even more reactionary. Charles X fashioned himself as an old-style absolutist, and he attempted to undermine the political authority of the chamber, despite his support of the Ultras. More liberal representatives began to appear in the chamber, forcing Charles to work unlawfully around it. He attempted to undo the charter and rule by fiat. Word of this reached the streets of Paris, which erupted in violence. Fearing for his safety, Charles abdicated. However, a liberal majority in the chamber favored the ascension of the liberal Duke of Orleans, Louis-Philippe, to the throne. While Congress feared this revolution at first, the limited change in government convinced it not to invade. Legitimacy was still based on monarchical power, although nobility was again abolished. The July Monarchy, as it was named, showed its willingness to limit liberalism through its violent suppression of Lyonnese silkworkers in 1831, who sought a greater say in government. The Restoration era as a whole can be characterized as one that sought to turn back the clock while at the same time pragmatically recognizing deep structural changes in European society. The political struggles of this era will be coupled with the experiences of industrialization, together which would further erode the social structures of Europe and lead to new issues in political life.